I'm Kennedy.
And I'm...
Hi. Hello.
Hello! My name is Kimberly Drew. I'm an author and independent curator based here in New York, along with Kennedy Yanko. And today we're going to have a conversation about her exhibition, Salient Queens, and abstraction and beauty and, whatever else we get into.
Hi, my name is Kennedy Yanko. I'm an artist, a sculptor and painter based in Brooklyn. And my art practice is based on the ambiguities within perception and the importance of abstraction as an intuitive tool.
And I wonder if you could talk specifically first, maybe we'll start with the show and then we can work our way backwards. Why Salient Queens? What drove you to making this body of work? Can you talk to me a little bit about the process?
Of course. When I was younger, I was really fond of the abstract expressionists and the work that they were doing. I had like a really physical and visceral reaction to the work they were making. And it wasn't until later on in my life that I realized that this movement of people and artists were the rebels, they were bohemian, they were counterculture, they were everything against what they were given, or they were responding to what they were given. And for me in that moment, when those two things came together, kind of like the nature of these artists and then how that translated into the physicality in their work, something really became full and made sense for me in the realization that it's so important to understand the artist to fully understand the work and to fully understand where they're coming from and what their influences are, and how everything that we do as artists is merely a digestion of the world around us, and then it becomes this tangible object. So to me, there was something really important that I felt often doesn't always go looked at, which is like the importance of the intention and the transmutation that happens from the artist to the work. So for me, with my materials, when I'm thinking about metal, I'm interested in, or I'm thinking about metal as something that's from the periodic table of elements and something that is, at its core, it's made of atoms and it comes from the ground. And I'm not as interested in the industrial processing of these materials. And so for me, with that intention in the work and this idea around metal being something that is no different than me, it changes the entire experience of it because of my intention and because I'm imbuing this with a sense of life in a way. And I do believe that there is some kind of transmutation that happens in that intention. So the realm that my work, or the conversations where my work tends to go is, people will talk about John Chamberlain, or they'll talk about metal as a material that's mainly used by men. And that's a strange thing for me. That's a strange conversation because I don't feel so connected to those ideas. And with this show, I really just felt it important as I'm coming into space as a woman and as an artist, that the reality of how I'm speaking about my work needs to be becoming a part of it, to recognize what these are. And all of these pieces are dedicated to the women in my life that have shown me how to take up space and how to own that and be that and present in it.
I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you want people to encounter these works, because so much of, I think, the way that, especially when you're talking about abstraction, your relationship to abstraction, it's really the experience of the work. You want people to have a series of emotions maybe, or thoughts. I wonder if you could talk about your hopes for the viewer's experience.
I think that one thing that I know for sure is that there are certain people that can understand, I think, a visual language very quickly and clearly. And there are some people who don't, and who need more of like a narrative or like figuration or something like that. And I'm really interested in bringing more awareness around kind of this closed circuit thinking that we naturally do in order to be able to function in the world and to move around. The way that the eyes and the brain communicate and they speak is that there is an immediate association with things, right? So it's the things that we already know. It's our conditioned understandings of the world. And without that reality, right? Without that understanding that our minds are already doing that, we miss this huge opportunity for expansion or or a broader experience, because I'm coming to every situation already knowing. So I think for me, I'm really interested in asking people to come with a clean slate and to be more open to the nuances or the sensory nuances within themselves. And that's really the important thing about vision, being able to see something that is not necessarily in front of us or shown with our eyes. And Aristotle, I think, in the beginning of metaphysics, talks about how the entire experience is about seeing, but it's not. There's so much more to be considered, and I think by bringing attention to that, to the awareness of our behavior, can be really powerful when interpreting objects, when speaking with people, with responding to situations, and just to move with a almost kind of like a childlike understanding of things, being more open, being ready to learn, to listen.
I think it's interesting though, because it's not just about childlike or just about like activating from like a very base foundational understanding, but a really profound way of interacting with something. Like even the notion of seeing something isn't the only way to interact with a work. Like I think one of the greatest gifts that we have in sculpture is that there's a tactile experience, right? Even if you are low vision, even if you are blind, you can interact with sculpture in a way that you may not be able to interact with a painting, or even something that's in 2D relief. You have the opportunity to really engage, explore. There's dimensions, and there's of course weight. And I wonder if you could talk about, especially scale. Like I think one of the things I really love, especially in relationship to artists who are working in sculpture, working with materials that are extremely malleable, that means that your opportunity for expansiveness is kind of just whatever you want to create. Like you set your own limit, and then of course like the gallery size, whatever. But I wonder if you could talk about scale and how you want people maybe to interact from that kind of standpoint with the work.
It's interesting too, because it's like I'm also still thinking of them as paintings in a way. But I think as far as like the scale goes, or the physicality of them, one thing that's been really fascinating to me that wasn't necessarily an intention as the artist, but to find that my materials kind of have this ambiguous quality to them, where you can't tell if they're heavy or light, if they're soft or if they're hard. And that also kind of goes back to like the intention of like their atomic quality, right? So because I'm using paint skins that look similar to the metal, and they have the same kind of pores and dips and movement and hills and valleys in it, that you don't necessarily understand what it is. So I think that is that engages people in a way. It provokes a sense of curiosity, like an innate curiosity, and trying to understand it and to get close with them. And I think if anything, they kind of create these little worlds in a way. And I love that idea that they create like a space to explore and kind of dive into, and you can really feel it in your body, and your body becomes curious about it.
I wonder, it's funny because like I'm obsessed with John Chamberlain, just full disclosure. I'm not going to talk to you about John Chamberlain. I just want to also qualify this and say I really love John Chamberlain.
I love John Chamberlain too.
It's interesting that people relate your work so much, because it's just like a really, I think, it's an interesting connection to make. What were you going to say?
Well, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not like strange.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people are aware of what I'm actually doing with paint, or like what my intentions are as an artist. And I think an immediate association would be, oh yeah, the other guy who's using found metal, the other guy that we all know about,
right.
Because there's Richard Hunt, who was actually doing it before John Chamberlain. There's César, they were all within the same like 10-year period. But Chamberlain's the guy that everybody knows, so it's like, Yeah.
Everyone's like doing free word association. They're like,
Yeah.
It's metal, it's this. We're, setting it on fire, so it must be this one thing. But when I look at your work, I also think a lot about Barbara Chaser Bode's work. And I think a lot about her poetry. I think a lot about her interest in beauty. And I wonder if you think about beauty, especially because you're applying, these atomic forces through color. You're imbuing something on top of something that is found. And not that there's not an artfulness in the finding, but there's decisions that you're making in how you want to represent and reappropriate these materials. And I wonder if beauty is a priority for you.
Yeah, very much so. And maybe the things that I think are beautiful might not be beautiful for everyone else. But when I'm formally interacting with the work, I'm looking at how the skins can more fully articulate what's happening with the metal. So I'm looking at the rust, the kind of the muddy colors that I'm finding, and I'm making it more of a thorough gesture by kind of like finishing it, by incorporating these two very separate entities that then can only be whole and full when they're together. And I think, the idea of beauty is contrast. That's really important. I think that's where that power is. And I think also thinking about metal too, like how it has this like industrial connotation or this kind of like physical, laborious context, but really at its core, it's like, it's soft. It's a responsive material. You heat it up, you fire it up, you bend it, you weld it, it's responsive. So really in its core, it's kind of like this full entity in a way. I think beauty is a very powerful thing, and I think it's something that moves us and drives us in ways that we don't even necessarily understand.
I think it's something that it makes me think of Tony K. Bambara as well. Like, the job is making the work irresistible in many ways. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the way that beauty can be utilized in a practice is that it's part of like a multi-step process. There is that moment where you catch something's eye. There's that moment where something might catch your eye, and it might be the gesture, but as you look for longer, you come into other elements or other understandings. And we've talked in the past about, especially your life as an artist, and some of the ways I think especially that people can overdetermine how they want to relate to younger artists or more emerging artists, or artists who are getting their due in a moment where they may not have known that you've been working for 15 years, and they see this new person and they want to interpret and understand, and so they might say it's like this or it's like that. And I wonder for you how you're able, not necessarily to overcome, because I don't think it's something to overcome, I think it is something that's extended from a space of generosity, but I wonder how, I guess, you're able to carve out who and how you want to be interpreted as an artist in a moment like that one, where there might be these overdeterminations about what people might see at first glance, if that makes sense.
I think one of my newer things that I'm like learning is like how important my archival practice is. And I think in general, like as a woman or as an artist or as a person of color, like I have to corral my conversation, right? Like I'm always going to have to be very clear about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and everyone's always going to have their own interpretation of it, and that's totally fine. But I think for me, when it comes to seeing and when it comes to the evolution of art and people, we can't go anywhere without having a certain kind of patience and sensitivity to the intimacy that happens within engagement. Right. And so I think for me, it's like in my core, I know what I am, I know what I'm making, I know what I believe in. And it's like when you meet someone whose vibes are off, like you just know right away, like this isn't working. And so I think just trusting what I believe in, and like I've been saying the same thing my whole life. My interests, my philosophical interests, my intellectual interests, like my curiosity in psychology and making, they all make sense. So it was never something that wasn't mine. I think I just have to, we have to fight for it. We just have to create more conversations like this and be vulnerable. I really am trying my best to open myself up every time to a conversation, to like new ideas and to new things. And I just hope that I get that in return.
What are some of the things that you would say that you're fighting for in terms of how you want either this body of work to be understood, or how you want the snapshot of this moment in your practice to be understood? What gets lost sometimes? What do you feel like you really want people to understand?
I want people to understand patience. It's something that I've struggled with and had to learn, and I've spent a lot of time alone in here learning that and understanding what that means with interacting with others, with interacting with my work. I want people to understand and value their own experience too. I think there's a lot to be said for like, a lot of people aren't comfortable talking about art, and a lot of people aren't comfortable talking about abstraction, and a lot of that I think has to do with the jargon that's been built around it. But I think for me in general, it's just like the work that I'm creating now is so close to my heart. And each one of these pieces are, and I wouldn't normally say this, but they are some form of non-representational portraiture in a way, because it's this idea of transmitting, the women that have shown me this space, like Judith Malena, There's a piece called Judith, and Judith was such an influential person in my life. When I came to New York, I lived at the Living Theater for 4 years, and she was the director there. She was like 84 years old, and we were all caring for her, and she was just a beast. I mean, every day she would sit in her journal and she would just write everything that she would do. Her every hour was planned, and she showed me what it looks like to be a working and living artist. And then another one's after my mom, who is just, you know, Leo extravaganza. You know, it's just like, it's all energy. It's being there, be right there. This is it, you know, and like the piece literally encapsulates so much of her and her essence. And I'm really interested in this idea of kind of like getting it to the core of what these things are. And I think sometimes through forms of ambiguity you can do that, right? It's like once we dissolve all these things we know, then we have space to explore it. So one of the pieces too, I did a little photo shoot with some of my friends before, because I just like had this vision of like having this solar system of women around me that have been holding me up. And I found this orange dress, and I was like, oh wow, this is amazing. I could just see the color, because whenever I imagine kind of like the layout of the show, I always see these like dots of color in a way. And so we found this beautiful orange dress, and we shot this image with with me and the 4 women. And it was like a really, really special moment to see that. And then later I was working in the metal yards, just like for general work. I wasn't necessarily making something for the show, but I was having trouble finding the pieces that I wanted, because it's like construction's been down. There hasn't been like as many people scrapping. So like I've been going extensive measures like to Baltimore or Philadelphia, or like just all over the East Coast, looking for materials and yards that I could work in. And I found this orange piece, which I never use orange in my studio. I don't like it. It's too bright for me. Like, it doesn't usually work. And in the process of working with the materials, I'm generally like learning what I'm interested in as I'm working with them. There's a kind of this catharsis that moves through me in the actual making, and that's really the time where where I'm either working through whatever's going on in my life, digging through whatever I'm reading, who I'm engaging with, what I'm curious about, and I use that time to kind of explore it more. This piece started coming to life, and I realized that this was me. You know, like, this is me, this is my portrait, this is me being held up by all these women around me.
When you're imagining the physical space of maybe an exhibition space, or a moment where so many of these portraits, these kind of like tribute pieces are in space together, that you see them as these like color codes. And I wonder if you could talk about how, maybe now or in your practice in general, how you've related to color, why you've been drawn to color, how you produce the colors that you use.
Color for me has always been, you know, the beginning place for anything. That's what I'm looking for when I'm looking for my materials. That's how I'm thinking of everything. And I think there's a lot of power in that, in the way that it can evoke different sensations throughout the body, throughout the etheric body, and remind us of different things in our life, and kind of really be overwhelming to us. And for me, you know, color's always, like, I've always, and especially more so lately, I've really been attracted to very like subdued, kind of muddy, kind of ugly colors is what I call them. I really like ugly colors. And I think that they just allow a place for me to kind of explore and move through.
It's interesting we call them ugly colors. I'm just like, I'm in such a moment in my life where I'm like, there is no such thing as an ugly color. Like, no color also exists on its own, right? It's everything that we're interpreting around color is always in relationship. You know, it's maybe in relationship to your idea of the finished product. It's the relationship between the other colors that you're working with at the time, the other pieces that you're working with at the time. It's interesting that we're never really truly operating in a vacuum. And I wonder if you could talk about, I guess, in the process of making, how much control you're taking over, I guess, those relationships between the colors. Because there's, you know, especially in this series, and you were saying over the last few years you've been really investigating working in monochrome, and I wonder where that impulse to either focus or remove, because I think monochromatic kind of thinking is either or. I wonder if you could talk about that process and how you found yourself there.
Yeah, that's great. I definitely feel that it was more of like a reductionist approach to things. You know, I started editing work before I worked on it and had to take it away. Because my painting practice was a very like physical, aggressive, in the moment, responsive body of work. You know, I was painting on canvases, I was making my own canvases with rubber, and it was very, very immediate. And so in order for me to be able to find kind of, I think, a more mature voice within the visual work I was making, was to kind of calm it down a little bit, like step back a little bit, and give it space to really like show itself. So for me, in like discovering the colors, I almost had to bring more attention to them, right? Like what, like, and to also see kind of the nuances of like how a brown can fade into like a gray and a blue, and then like what happens when those two come together, and like how they really affect each other, like the nuances of it, like finding that my own personal patience to explore that.
Like almost everything that you've said is such a profound metaphor for what it means to work with metal. You know, it's about patience. It's about working not against the material. Like I feel like there's a way that I'm sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a submission that happens at some point. Because you can't rush the process. If it gets too hot, if it gets too cold, you might break something. And I wonder if that is a possibility, or if that's a thing that you're like, what is that choreography like, I guess is the question.
I mean, I think for me, more than anything, like so much of what I'm doing, whether it's like painting or making installations or working with sculpture, it is so responsive. Like whether, like if it's site specific, or if I'm responding to a piece of metal, or I'm like figuring out how this metal can bend, like what is the actual possibility there, where how the skins can fit into it. I'm responding to what's there. So I actually have a background in Qigong and Tai Chi and yoga, and when I was 15 to 21, I studied with my Sifu, which is teacher in Chinese, and I studied with him for 7 years, very intensely. So I've always been I've always been very informed in this kind of like Taoist way of experiencing and responding and kind of allowing in a way.
What does the process of completion look like?
Like when something's finished? Yeah,
like what is the allowance that you give a work that then it can be seen and interpreted by others? When does that process of allowing, because it sounds like you could allow things forever, you know? How do you draw that stop point? Is there a stop point?
Yeah, and I think it's a very clear stop point too, but sometimes it takes longer than normal. I think for me, you know, I don't ever have like a clear vision of what something's going to look like when it's done. It's very rare. I think more now in my work, it's been happening more often, which is like kind of amazing. I'm just like, wow, I can't believe this actually came out the way it did. But I think that stop point is just, it's a very clear, like yelling voice, like this is done. You know, it's finished, it's done, it makes sense, it's perfect. And like, I don't like stuff to leave my studio unless I really feel like I can look back at this in 20 years and be very proud of what it represents and what was happening to me at that time in my life and what it meant to me. So it's not so much about like making a decision as much as it is kind of a waiting game, and then making decisions and then waiting and then making more decisions. And that's also, I think, how my practice changed so dramatically too when I did start editing, and when I started kind of like having a more reductionist approach to my practice, was that it was a lot more decision making, and it wasn't so visceral, and it wasn't so immediate and aggressive. It was very delicate in a way. And that opened me up in a lot of ways. And also working in sculpture too. I mean, you know, it's like I was a painter for such a long time alone in the studio, and it's a very like isolated, private life, and there's a lot of beauty and great things that happen there. But when I started working with sculpture, like I needed people around me. Like I can't lift these up by myself. You know, I kind of had to come into the world in a way, and that changed my life so much because, you know, I really started to make great friends. My whole life has been dedicated to like making work. And now that there's people around me like making work with me and helping me and working together, it's just allowed me to open up more personally. And it's so funny how so much of my life comes out through these things and how I'm learning and understanding.
I think that's a really good segue to talk more specifically about this show, and talk about the title. Why Salient Queens, and what does that mean to you, especially with anyone who watches this, spoiler alert, the knowledge that there's so many ways that you're responding to specific people, to specific energy exchanges that you've been privileged to experience.
I think that privilege is one of the best words to put it. The grace that I've been exposed to has been so immense, and the love has been so deep. Salient Queens, it means that of most importance, the most important queens to me, and the people that in my life that have shown me how to more deeply understand myself, my interactions with the world around me, and allowing me to be that. I think for a really long time I made myself smaller for people. I wanted to make people comfortable. I didn't want to show up as big as I can be, and I don't think the work did either. And upon reflection, looking at this conversation, these women were moving mountains, whether it was in wiping my face off or just living their life and showing me what it means to be this, and that I can make monuments, and that I can build buildings, and that I can create cities and communities. And that is such an incredibly empowering thing to me. And just knowing that I can carry on that legacy and that language, and that I have a responsibility to do so. My work isn't always about that. I think more recently, with my last show, Hannah, I started kind of exploring my experience biographically as an avenue and an opportunity to help people better understand these more, I don't want to say esoteric, but these more nuanced ideologies. And it's been a fun thing for me, because sharing is such an important part of what I do. My work is not complete until someone gets to experience it in front, and they finish the work, right? And for me to be able to share my process, I've been a diarist for 15 years, for 20, since I was 10 years old, so 20 years. And I've just always kind of explored the world through exploring myself more deeply.
I wonder if you could talk about queens, because I think there's yes, queen, there's so many ways that terminology, and especially even within our historical perspective, thinking about patronship, there's so many ways that queens as a verbiage could be interpreted. And I wonder if your own words, if you could talk about why you've chosen that as the verbiage here.
Mm-hmm. I think queens to me is more of the essence of grace. And what that means and how that relates to the world around you. The pieces are also named after my friends that are men, that have shown me how to be the queen that I am, and how to share grace, and how to push that love into the world. So queens is not necessarily, to me it means, that grounding, graceful, that presence that kind of expands beyond yourself to offer others more space in a way.
I love that. There's such a physicality to the work that you're doing. We were talking earlier, or we have been talking over time really, about the ways that people might interact with your work, the physicality of it, seeing it from these different vantage points, seeing your work over time, seeing how it's developed. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about either the body that's seeing the work, the bodies that might be seen in the work, and the body of work.
Anthony, are you recording? Okay.
Sorry. Don't do that.
Sorry. People are always talking about how they see the body in my work, and I was like, oh, okay. I didn't see it. There's a very particular composition and shape that I'm looking for, which is always off. You will very rarely see lines in my work. And I think that that's also been part of the one thing that I've studied so deeply, from Qigong, Tai Chi, bodybuilding, yoga, consciousness, psychology, philosophy, that is the one thing that really has always had my full attention. And I think that that is really the most clear translation and transmutation of from thought to reality, and this physical manifestation of what I'm most interested in, and then it really shows up in that way. So I think that my relationship to the body and my relationship to abstraction are the same thing. There's no difference. it's such a hard thing to describe with words.